The sound of the car door closing in the driveway was not the familiar, welcome thud of my son's sedan. It was heavier, final, like the ceiling of a tomb. I watched from the kitchen window, my hands pausing in the soapy water, a plate suspended between worlds. There was Mark, my boy, his shoulders slumped with a weight I hadn't seen since his college finals. And then the other door opened and he emerged. My father, Robert. He stood on the paved driveway as if he'd been dropped from a great height, disoriented and frail. The man who had once seemed a giant, whose hands could effortlessly toss me into the air, now looked small, dwarfed by Mark's suburban house. He clutched a small worn duffel bag that contained, I would later learn, the entirety of his life now. The rest was in boxes or in the past. Mark had called me 2 days prior, his voice a strained wire. Mom's gone, Sarah. The house is too much for him. He can't be alone. There was a plea in his words, a silent begging for me to understand, to agree. And I did, in theory. Of course, a man shouldn't be alone after losing his wife of 50 years. But understanding and the reality of his shadow in our home were two very different countries. I dried my hands, the cheerful gingham towel feeling like a mockery, and went to the front door. The air in the house shifted as Mark let him in. It smelled of lemon polish and the chicken roasting in the oven, but now an alien scent entered with them, the faint melancholic aroma of old books and mothballs. Sarah, you remember my dad, Robert? Mark said, his voice too bright, too forced. Of course. Hello, Robert. I said, my smile a tight practice line. He looked at me, his eyes a milky, distant blue. There was no recognition in them, not of me, not of the moment. Just a vague, polite confusion. This is a lovely home, he murmured, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. He wasn't looking at the vaulted ceilings or the art on the walls. He was looking at the floor, as if searching for a path. That first evening was a masterclass in awkwardness. We sat at the dining table, a modern glass-top thing that suddenly felt terribly fragile. Robert ate slowly, meticulously, his movements precise and deliberate. He brought his own silence with him, a dense woolen blanket that smothered our usual dinner chatter about work, about our son Liam's soccer game, about anything. Liam, usually a fountain of 8-year-old energy, was quiet, watching this new ancient person with wide, uncertain eyes. Later, after Robert was settled in the guest room, my guest room, the one I used for my sewing, the one with the good light, the dam broke. I was in the kitchen, putting away the last of the wine glasses, the tension coiling in my shoulders. Mark came in, his face drawn. I know this is hard, Sarah. Hard. The word came out sharper than I intended. I turned to face him, the day's suppressed frustration bubbling to the surface. Mark, this is our home. Our space. We didn't discuss this. We didn't plan for this. What was I supposed to do? Leave him there to wither away? There are other options. Assisted living, a retirement community. Something that doesn't involve him. Living here. He's my father, Sarah. And this is my sanctuary. I gestured around the kitchen at the life we had built. Why is this old man here? Do we have extra space? Is there some room I'm not aware of that we've just been saving for a rainy day? The words hung in the air, cruel and loud in the quiet house. I hadn't meant to shout them, but they were out now, the raw, unfiltered truth of my feelings. Mark flinched as if I'd struck him. His face hardened. He has nowhere else to go, he said, his voice low and cold. He's staying. We'll make it work. He walked out, leaving me alone in the bright, silent kitchen. I leaned against the counter, my heart pounding. I looked toward the hallway that led to the guest room. The door was closed, but his presence was a palpable thing, seeping under the doorframe, filling the house. He was a relic from a past I had no part in, a quiet, crumbling monument to a life I didn't understand. He was a responsibility, an intrusion. Problem. In that moment, he was not a man grieving his wife. He was just the old man in the room down the hall, and the question I had screamed echoed back at me, unanswered and terrifying. Why was he here? Our carefully ordered life had been irrevocably altered, and the first chapter of this new, unwelcome story had only just begun. The silence in the house the next morning was a different creature altogether. It was not the peaceful, slumbering quiet of a Saturday dawn, but a thick, watchful hush, as if the very walls were holding their breath. The air, once filled with the easy cadence of our lives, now felt thin and strained, partitioned by invisible walls. I was the first to rise, a habit born from motherhood, but the kitchen was already occupied. Robert was there, standing by the large window that looked out onto the backyard. He wasn't moving, wasn't drinking coffee, wasn't reading the paper. He was simply standing, a still life portrait of a man adrift in a foreign land. He had dressed in crisp, old-fashioned trousers and a button-down shirt, as if for a meeting that had long since been cancelled. He didn't hear me enter, his gaze fixed on something, or nothing, in the middle distance. I retreated without a word, the cheerful good morning I usually offered my family dying on my lips, the first skirmish in the battle for my own kitchen, and I had surrendered without a sound. When Mark emerged, the fracture between us was a physical presence at the breakfast table. We spoke in clipped, functional phrases, a language designed for cohabitation, not connection. More coffee, please. Liam has practice at 10. I'll take him. We were orbiting each other, careful not to collide. Liam, sensitive to the atmospheric pressure in the house, was uncharacteristically quiet, pushing his cereal around his bowl. He kept glancing towards the hallway, waiting for the old man to reappear. The division manifested in the smallest of territories. The remote control, once fought over with good-natured bickering between Mark and Liam, now sat untouched on the coffee table, a neutral artifact in a cold war. The bathroom schedule, a finely tuned machine of our morning routine, was thrown into disarray by Robert's predictably unpredictable needs. A faint, medicinal smell now lingered where my citrus-scented diffuser used to hold dominion. The true battleground, however, was the guest room. My sewing room. My sanctuary. Later that afternoon, driven by a restless, resentful energy, I opened the door. The change was a physical blow. My sewing machine was shrouded with a towel, pushed to the corner of the desk. The vibrant, colorful spools of thread I kept in a glass jar were now hidden away in a drawer. In their place on the nightstand sat a small framed black and white photograph of a woman I barely recognized, a younger, smiling version of Mark's mother, Eleanor. Next to it was a leather-bound Bible and a single worn hearing aid case. The room smelled of him. That faint, powdery old person scent had colonized the space, erasing the familiar aroma of fabric and possibility. This was no longer my room. It was his territory, marked by the artifacts of a life that was fading, a life that was now imposing its quiet weight upon my own. I closed the door quickly, my heart thumping with a sense of violation. It wasn't just a room. It was a symbol of my former freedom, and it had been annexed. Dinner that night was a reprise of the first, but worse because the novelty had worn off, leaving only the grim reality. Robert ate his food with a quiet, methodical precision, chewing each mouthful an interminable number of times. He did not initiate conversation. When spoken to, he would look up, his eyes taking a moment to focus, and offer a brief, polite, and entirely terminal response. "Did you have a good day, Dad?" Mark asked, his voice straining for normalcy. "It was quiet," Robert replied, and then returned his attention to his peas. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam, desperate to fill it, launched into a loud, detailed account of a goal he almost scored at practice. Halfway through his story, Robert, unaccustomed to the boy's high-pitched, rapid-fire delivery, flinched almost imperceptibly. He didn't say anything, but the slight recoil was a dismissal more potent than words. Liam's face fell, his story trailing off into a mumble. He spent the rest of the meal in silence, and a fresh wave of anger, hot and protective, washed over me. He was hurting my son. Unintentionally perhaps, but the damage was being done. After we put Liam to bed, the tension between Mark and me finally snapped. It started in the kitchen, over the trivial act of loading the dishwasher. "You can't just put the glasses on the bottom rack, Mark," I said, my voice tight. "They'll crack." "It's a dishwasher, Sarah, not a surgical instrument," he shot back, slamming a plate into the rack. "Maybe we could all just be a little less precious about things for a while." "Precious? This is about order. This is about things not breaking. It's about more than that, and you know it," he said, turning to face me, his eyes blazing. "It's about him. You've made it perfectly clear he's not welcome here." "And whose fault is that?" I hissed, keeping my voice low so the sound wouldn't carry. You brought a stranger into our home and expected us to just carry on as if nothing happened. You didn't ask me, Mark. You didn't ask Liam. You just decided. He's my father. I didn't have a choice. There are always choices. You just chose the one that was easiest for you and hardest for us. The words hung in the air. A brutal, honest accusation. Mark stared at me, a mixture of anger and profound hurt in his eyes. He didn't have a retort. He just shook his head slowly, turned and walked away, retreating to the living room where he sat in the dark, the blue glow of the silent television flickering across his stony face. I stood alone in the bright, cold kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly loud. The house was indeed divided. It was no longer just our home. It was my territory, Mark's loyalty, Liam's confusion, and Robert's silent, occupying presence. We were a family of islands, separated by a sea of unspoken resentments and a single unanswerable question. How long could we live like this before one of us drowned? The tension had solidified into a new, miserable normal. We moved through the house like ghosts, speaking only when necessary, our conversations stripped down to the bare bones of logistics. Mark and I were sleeping in the same bed, but a chasm lay between us, wide and cold. Liam had become a quiet observer, his laughter a rare and fleeting sound. And Robert was a statue in the armchair by the living room window, a permanent fixture of silence and stillness. It was Liam who inadvertently became the catalyst for change. A school project on family history had been announced, and he, in his innocent desperation to find a connection, had turned to the one source of history in the house. "Grandpa," he asked, his small voice cutting through the evening's quiet, "did you have a job when you were a dad?" Robert turned his head slowly, his eyes focusing on Liam with more clarity than I had seen since his arrival. "I was an engineer," he said, his voice a little less rusty than usual. "I built bridges." Liam's eyes widened. "Real bridges? That cars drive on?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Robert's lips. "Yes, real bridges." That was the end of the conversation, but it planted a seed in Liam's mind. The next day he came to me, his face alight with a plan. "Mom, for my project I need pictures. Of Grandpa. And Grandma. Do we have any?" We had none. Mark's relationship with his parents had always been distant, formal. They were photographs on a mantelpiece, not living, breathing people in our lives. I told Liam as much, but his face fell so dramatically that I felt a pang of guilt. This division was costing him more than any of us. "Maybe," I said, an idea forming reluctantly, "maybe there are some things in the attic." The attic was a place of out of sight, out of mind. It was where we stored Christmas decorations, old baby clothes, and the assorted detritus of a life we were too busy living to cure it. The air was thick with dust and the smell of dried-out wood. Mark was at work, Robert was in his chair, and I felt a strange sense of trespass, as if I were delving into a past that wasn't mine to uncover. Liam, however, was a determined archaeologist. He pushed past boxes labeled kitchen miscellaneous and winter coats, his mission clear. And then, tucked behind my old university textbooks, he found it. A single medium-sized cardboard box, unassuming and coated in a fine gray fur of dust. It wasn't one of ours. The handwriting on the side, in a precise, sloping script, read, "Robert Personal." "Mom, this one!" Liam exclaimed, dragging it toward the attic's single bare light bulb. My first instinct was to stop him. This felt like a violation of the tenuous privacy we had established. But Liam's hopeful eyes were too powerful. With a sigh, I lifted the box down and we carried it to his room, away from Robert's silent vigil. We sat on the floor, surrounded by Liam's Legos and stuffed animals, and opened the flaps. The past, carefully packed away, breathed out in a sigh of old paper and faded memories. The top layer was photographs, but they were not the stiff, formal portraits I expected. They were candid snapshots, their edges curling. A young Robert, not much older than Mark, with a head full of dark hair and a confident, easy smile, his arms slung around a beautiful, beaming Eleanor. They were standing on a rocky outcrop, a half-built bridge spanning a chasm behind them. In another, he was in a hard hat, pointing at a blueprint, his face alight with concentration. There were pictures of him holding a baby Mark, his large, capable hands looking both clumsy and incredibly gentle. He was not the silent, faded man in our living room. He was a builder, a husband, a father. A man with a life. Beneath the photos were artifacts. A slide rule, its markings worn from use. A leather-bound notebook. Liam opened it carefully. It was filled not with calculations but with sketches. Delicate, beautiful drawings of Bridges, yes, but also of Eleanor, her face captured in a dozen different angles and moods. On one page, a single elegantly drawn rose was captioned in that same sloping script. For E, who is my strongest foundation. My breath caught in my throat. This was a love letter. A testament to a devotion I had never glimpsed. And then at the very bottom, Liam pulled out a small flat case. He opened it. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a medal. A bronze star. Next to it was a formal black and white military photograph of a young, stern-faced Robert in uniform. The pieces of the puzzle, ones I had never known existed, began to click into place. The engineer. The soldier. The artist. The devoted husband. The silent, grieving man in our armchair was not a single, simple entity. He was a library of lives, all of them now closed and gathering dust. The old man I had so resented was a continent of experiences I had never bothered to explore. Liam looked from the medal to the sketches, his young mind trying to reconcile these heroic images with the fragile grandfather in the next room. He built bridges, Liam whispered, his voice full of awe. And he was a soldier. I looked at the box, its contents spilling out onto the carpet, and felt the first deep fissure of shame crack through the wall of my resentment. I had been so focused on the space he was taking up in my present, I had never once considered the vast, monumental life he had lived before he entered it. We hadn't just brought an old man into our home. We had brought in a history, and I had been too blind, too selfish to see it. The division in the house, I realized with a sinking heart, wasn't just his presence. It was my own refusal to look beyond it. The contents of the cardboard box lay between Liam and me on his bedroom floor. A silent, sprawling accusation. The dust from the attic still clung to our clothes and the air, but it was the dust of forgotten history, not just neglect. Liam gently picked up the military photograph, his small fingers careful on the aged edges. Was Grandpa a hero? He asked, his voice hushed with reverence. The word hero felt too grand, too simple for the complex man emerging from this box. I don't know, sweetie, I said honestly. But he was certainly more than we knew. My eyes were drawn back to the leather-bound notebook. I picked it up again, its soft, worn cover feeling intimate in my hands. I turned the pages more slowly this time, past the technical sketches of cantilevers and suspension cables, past the tender portraits of Eleanor. Deeper into the book, the drawings changed. The confident, flowing lines became tighter, more frantic. There were pages filled not with bridges, but with stark, desolate landscapes. Barren trees, ruined buildings. And faces, hollow-eyed, weary faces of young men in uniform. These were not loving sketches. They were exorcisms, attempts to scrape trauma from his mind onto paper. Then, tucked between two of these darker pages, I found it. A single faded color photograph, its corners soft from handling. It showed Robert and Eleanor, perhaps in their late 30s. They were sitting on a picnic blanket in dappled sunlight, the same half-built bridge from the other photos visible in the distance behind them. Eleanor was leaning against Robert, her head on his shoulder, laughing at something just outside the frame. But it was Robert's face that held me captive. He was looking down at her, and the expression on his face was one of such raw, unguarded adoration that it felt like a physical blow. It was a look that contained entire universes of love, of partnership, of a shared life. This was not the distant, polite man picking at his peas at my dinner table. This was a man deeply, profoundly in love. The photograph was a key, unlocking a door I hadn't known was closed. The silent, stoic presence in our home wasn't just a grieving widower. He was a man whose entire world had been extinguished. Eleanor wasn't just a wife who had passed away. She was his foundation, his strongest foundation, as he had written. He hadn't just lost a person. He had lost his anchor to life itself. Later that evening, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The box had changed the very particles in the air. When Robert retreated to his room after dinner, I didn't feel the usual surge of resentment. Instead, I felt a nervous, fluttering curiosity. I found Mark in the living room, staring at the blank television screen. The same defeated posture he'd worn for weeks. "I need to show you something," I said quietly. He looked up, wary, expecting another argument. I led him to Liam's room, where the artifacts were still laid out. I handed him the notebook, open to the page with the rose. I watched as his eyes scanned the drawing, then read the caption. His jaw tightened. He slowly sank to the floor, picking up the military photo, the candid snapshots, his movements heavy with a dawning realization. "He never talked about her," Mark whispered, his voice thick. "Not like this. He never talked about any of it. The war, his work. It was just facts. I was an engineer. I served. That was it." He picked up the faded picnic photograph, his thumb tracing the image of his father's face. "I've never seen him look like this." "Because she was his everything," I said, the truth of it settling deep within me. "We didn't just bring your father to live with us, Mark. We brought a man who has lost his entire reason for being." Mark looked from the vibrant, loving man in the photo to the closed door of the guest room, and I saw the same shame I had felt earlier reflected in his eyes. We had both failed him. Mark by assuming the stoicism was just his father's nature, and me by seeing only an inconvenient shadow of a man. The buried past was no longer buried. It was here in our son's room, demanding to be acknowledged. The silent, monolithic figure of the old man had shattered, and in its place was the complex, heartbreaking story of Robert. The builder, the soldier, the artist, the widower. The war had likely taught him to bury his pain deep, to build walls around his heart as strong as the bridges he built over rivers. And Eleanor had been the one person allowed inside those walls. Now, with her gone, the walls had become a tomb. That night, as I lay in bed next to Mark, the chasm between us felt different. It was no longer filled with the hot lava of anger, but with the cool, sobering waters of a shared regret. We weren't staring at each other from opposite sides. We were both looking in the same direction, toward that closed door down the hall, and toward the man we had both, in our own ways, refused to see. The question was no longer, "Why is this old man here?" The question, now heavy with responsibility and a gnawing guilt, had become, "How could we have been so blind?" The faded photograph had not just illuminated his past. It had held up a stark, unflattering mirror to our own present. We had been living with a monument to loss, and all we had done was complain about the space it was taking up. The house was still quiet, but the quality of the silence had transformed. It was no longer a tense, loaded quiet, bristling with unspoken grievances. It had become a listening silence. The revelations from the attic box hung in the air, changing the very way we perceived the man in the armchair by the window. We were no longer just seeing his silence. We were beginning to hear it. It started with small things, observations made through a new, more compassionate lens. I noticed now that his stillness by the window wasn't empty. His eyes, those milky, distant blues, would follow a bird as it landed on the fence, or track the progress of a cloud across the sky. It wasn't a vacant stare. It was a quiet, weary observation of a world that continued to turn, a fact that must have seemed both cruel and miraculous to him. One afternoon, I saw him flinch, a subtle, almost imperceptible tightening of his shoulders, at the sound of a motorcycle backfiring on the street outside. It was a sound I would have never noticed before, lost in the general noise of life. But now I remembered the metal, the sketches of war, and the flinch translated itself. It wasn't just a startled reaction. It was a ghost from a battlefield, an echo of a trauma buried deep for decades. He had his rituals, patterns we had previously interpreted as stubbornness or strangeness. Every morning, he would meticulously make his bed, his large, once capable hand smoothing the coverlet with a precision that spoke of a life built on order and discipline. He would arrange the items on his nightstand, the photograph of Eleanor, the Bible, the hearing aid case, in an exact, unvarying pattern. I had seen it as the fastidiousness of an old man. Now I saw it for what it was. A desperate attempt to impose control on a small corner of a world that had spiraled into chaos. It was the last remaining architecture of his former self. Mark was trying too. The attempts were clumsy, born of years of formal distance, but they were efforts. He started sitting with his father in the living room after dinner, not talking, just sharing the space. At first, the silence between them was awkward, a canyon of unspoken history. But after a few days, it began to soften. Mark would bring his laptop and work. Robert would look out the window. They were two men, sharing a quiet companionship, a language without words. The real breakthrough, however, came from Liam. Unburdened by the complex history and guilt that weighed on Mark and me, Liam approached his grandfather with the straightforward curiosity of a child. He brought the box of artifacts into the living room and, without asking, sat on the floor near Robert's chair. He held up the sketchbook, open to a detailed drawing of a truss bridge. "You drew this, Grandpa?" Liam asked. Robert looked down, his eyes focusing on the page. A long moment passed. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet. "That was the Mill Creek Bridge. Tricky one. The soil was unstable." Liam's eyes widened. "What did you do?" Another pause, then Robert spoke again, his words slow and deliberate. "We had to sink the pilings deeper. Used a new type of reinforcement." He didn't elaborate, but he had spoken more words to Liam in that one moment than he had to the rest of us in a week. Emboldened, Liam held up the military photograph. Robert's face tightened, the shutters coming down. But Liam, in his innocence, didn't push. He simply put the photo down and picked up the faded picnic picture instead. "Grandma is pretty," Liam said softly. Robert's gaze fell upon the photograph, and the change in him was profound. The tension drained from his shoulders. His stern expression softened, the lines on his face seeming to rearrange themselves into something gentler, more sorrowful. He didn't speak for a full minute, just looked at the image of his wife laughing in the sun. "She loved picnics," he finally murmured, the words so quiet we almost missed them. It wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. It was a statement to the universe, a confirmation of a memory that lived and breathed within him. "She always packed far too much food." My breath caught in my chest. I looked at Mark and I saw his eyes were glistening. It was a mere fragment, a splinter of the past, but it was an offering. He was speaking. Not the polite, closed-off replies we were used to, but a genuine personal memory. He was trusting us with a piece of his Eleanor. He was not a man of many words. His language was one of flinches and rituals, of quiet observation and carefully maintained order. His grief was a silent, private country, and he was its sole, lonely inhabitant. But we were no longer strangers pounding on the borders, demanding he explain himself. We were slowly, carefully learning to read the landscape. We were beginning to understand that his silence wasn't an emptiness. It was a deep, still lake, and beneath its surface lay entire sunken cities of love, loss, and memory. We had stopped shouting across the water and had begun, finally, to learn how to listen to the quiet. The fragile peace we had built, the delicate understanding born from the artifacts in the attic, was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon by the shrill, insistent ring of the doorbell. It was a sound that belonged to the world of salesmen and parcel deliveries, a mundane noise that heralded nothing but inconvenience. I opened the door to find a woman in a crisp, professional pantsuit, holding a leather-bound portfolio. She had the unshakably cheerful demeanor of someone whose business was other people's futures. "Good afternoon. I'm Cynthia from Golden Years Senior Living. I'm here for the 3 o'clock tour with Mr. Robert Evans." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I stared at her, my mind scrambling to make sense of the words. "I'm sorry. There must be a mistake." "Oh." She consulted her tablet. "The appointment was made by a Mark Evans?" "Regarding his father, Robert." The floor solidified beneath my feet, cold and hard. Mark. He had done this. Behind me I felt a presence. Robert had emerged from his room, drawn by the voices. He stood at the end of the hallway, his posture rigid, his face a carefully neutral mask. But his eyes, those windows we were just learning to see through, held a flicker of something. A dawning, horrified comprehension. "Please come in," I managed to say, my voice strangled. "There's been a misunderstanding." As Cynthia stepped into the foyer, her bright salesperson's eyes taking in the house, Mark's car pulled into the driveway. He came in, a forced, hopeful smile on his face that died the moment he saw my expression and his father standing like a sentinel in the hall. "Mark," I said, the single word dripping with a cold fury I hadn't known I possessed. "Cynthia from Golden Years is here. For a tour." The color drained from Mark's face. "Sarah, I can explain. I just thought we should look at our options." See what's out there. Options. My voice was low, dangerous. You made an appointment to have your father evaluated for a home without discussing it with me? Without discussing it with him. Cynthia, sensing the nuclear fallout she had inadvertently triggered, began to backpedal. We can certainly reschedule for a time that's more convenient for the whole family. But the damage was done. Robert took a slow, deliberate step forward. He looked not at me, not at the flustered saleswoman, but directly at his son. The neutral mask was gone, replaced by a raw, gut-wrenching expression of betrayal. It was the look of a man who had built bridges to connect worlds, only to find the one under his own feet crumbling to dust. You think I belong there? Robert's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a shard of glass. It wasn't a shout, it was a statement of profound hurt. With the other discards? Dad, no, it's not like that, Mark pleaded, his voice desperate. It's a beautiful place. There are activities, people your own age. I have an age, Robert interrupted, his gaze unwavering. I do not need a place designed for it. He looked around our home, his eyes sweeping over the living room where he had begun to tentatively reconnect with his grandson, the kitchen where he took his silent meals, the hallway that led to the room that held the ghost of my sewing machine and the entirety of his remaining life. I thought this was my home. With that, he turned and walked back down the hallway. His steps were not slow and shuffling but firm and final. He closed the door to his room, and the soft, definitive click of the latch was louder than any slam could have been. The foundation of our tenuous new family dynamic, so carefully and recently repaired, had not just cracked, it had split wide open. Cynthia made a hasty, mortified exit. Mark and I were left alone in the foyer, the silence between us a roaring tempest. You unbelievable fool, I whispered, the anger giving way to a devastating ache. After everything we just learned, after he just started to trust us. I was trying to find a solution. Mark shot back, but his defiance was weak, hollow. For us. For you. You're the one who asked why he was here. You're the one who didn't want him. His words were a punch to the gut because they held a kernel of the truth. My initial resentment had been the first fracture. But his action, this unilateral secretive decision, was the sledgehammer that had brought the whole structure down. We stood there, two people who had vowed to build a life together, staring at the wreckage of the family we had, and the one we had failed to become. The question was no longer about space or inconvenience. It was about betrayal, and whether a foundation built upon it could ever truly be rebuilt. The walls of the house felt paper-thin, and behind one of them, a man we had both failed was sitting alone, the door closed, the fragile bridges we had started to build now lying in ruins at his feet. The click of Robert's door latch echoed in the ensuing days, a sound more definitive than any argument. The house regressed, but the silence was different now. It wasn't the tense quiet of resentment, or the listening silence of newfound understanding. It was the cold, hollow silence of a tomb. Robert became a ghost in his own life. He still emerged for meals, but he no longer looked out the window. His eyes were fixed on a point somewhere inside himself, a retreat so complete it was terrifying. He ate mechanically, spoke not a single word, and returned to his room. The fragile connection Liam had forged was severed. When my son tried to show him a new drawing, Robert merely gave a slow, weary blink and looked away. The light that had flickered briefly behind his eyes had been extinguished. Mark and I orbited each other in a state of suspended animosity. The confrontation with Cynthia had laid bare a truth we could no longer ignore. We were not a team. We were two opposing forces, and Robert was the crumbling ground between us. We slept on the very edges of the bed, the space between us a frozen tundra. We communicated through notes on the fridge and terse text messages. The love that had built this home felt like a relic from a different century. The breaking point came from an unexpected direction. My mother called, her voice laced with the casual curiosity that often masked judgment. So, how is it having Mark's father there? It must be so difficult for you, dear. Such an invasion. And something in me snapped. Not with anger at her, but with a sudden blinding clarity. I heard my own voice from weeks ago screaming those same words. Why is this old man here? Do we have extra space? I heard the echo of my own resentment, and I saw with horrifying precision how it had given Mark permission to seek his solution. My venom had poisoned the well. I found Mark in the garage ostensibly organizing tools, but really just standing in the dim light, staring at a wall. The anger had drained from me, leaving behind a cold, clear pool of shame. "We can't go on like this," I said, my voice flat. He didn't turn around. "I know. I was wrong," I whispered. That made him turn. He looked at me, his face etched with exhaustion and confusion. "I started this," I continued, the words painful to force out. "That day he arrived. I created this war. I made him the enemy. I saw him as a problem to be solved, not a person to be understood. You were trying to fix the problem I defined." Mark was silent for a long moment. "I shouldn't have called that place without talking to you. Without talking to him. It was a betrayal." "It was," I agreed softly. "But I built the stage for it." I hugged my arms around myself, the chill in the garage seeping into my bones. We've been so focused on what his presence is costing us. Our space, our peace, our routine. We never stopped to think about what his presence here is costing him. I looked toward the house, imagining Robert sitting in the stark silence of his room. He lost the love of his life, the home they shared for 50 years, his independence, and every familiar rhythm of his existence. He sacrificed his entire world, and we've done nothing but make him feel like a burden for it. We asked him to give up everything, and then we made him pay rent for the space he takes up in our lives with his silence and his grief. The unspoken sacrifice hung in the air between us, immense and humbling. We had been tallying our own minor inconveniences while he was living a profound and devastating loss. We had treated his grief as an intrusion, his silence as a personal affront. Mark finally spoke, his voice raw. "What do we do, Sarah? How do we come back from this?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But it starts with us. It starts with stopping the war we started in this house. We have to stop seeing him as the problem." I took a shaky breath. "He's not the one who broke this family. We are." The truth of it was a weight, but it was a clean weight, a burden of responsibility rather than the corrosive poison of blame. We had failed him. Spectacularly. We had taken a man shattered by loss and, in our selfishness, had ground the pieces to dust. The unspoken sacrifice was his. The unspoken failure was ours. And the monumental task of atonement, we now understood, had to begin with us, in the cold silence of the garage, with a long overdue admission of our own terrible guilt. The apology did not happen in a grand cinematic moment. There was no single sweeping speech that magically mended all the broken pieces. Healing, we were beginning to understand, was not a destination but a slow, deliberate process of reconstruction. It began with a fundamental shift in our perception. Robert was no longer an occupant in our home. We were all inhabitants of a shared space, and it was our responsibility to make it a home for him too. Started with a chair. Not the armchair by the window where he sat in silence, but a place at the table, both literally and figuratively. That evening, instead of letting him retreat into his isolation after dinner, Mark gently stopped him. "Dad," he said, his voice careful but firm, "Liam has his school project. About your bridges. We were hoping you could help him." Robert paused, his hand on the doorframe, his back to us. He was still for so long I thought he would simply walk away. But then he slowly turned. He looked at Liam, who was holding the sketchbook with a hopeful, pleading expression. A flicker of the old connection, so recently severed, seemed to reignite. He gave a single, nearly imperceptible nod. He didn't sit at the head of the table, but he pulled out a chair next to Liam, and he began to talk. His voice was low and halting at first, but as Liam asked questions, pointing to the intricate drawings of trusses and pylons, the words began to flow more easily. He explained the physics of weight distribution, the art of reading a landscape, the challenge of poor soil. He wasn't just giving facts. He was sharing a passion, a piece of his soul that had been locked away for decades. Mark and I sat quietly listening, not as intruders, but as honored guests granted a glimpse into a hidden world. That small moment became a catalyst. We began to consciously make space for him. Not just physical space, but emotional and conversational space. We learned to sit in comfortable silence with him, without the pressure to fill it with noise. We discovered he loved classical music, so in the evenings, We would sometimes play a symphony softly in the background instead of turning on the television. The house, once a battleground of competing needs, began to find a new, more harmonious rhythm. One Saturday, I was in the kitchen, attempting a complicated recipe from a cookbook that had been gathering dust. Robert wandered in, drawn perhaps by the smell of herbs or the faint curse I muttered under my breath. He watched me for a moment, fumbling with the instructions. "You're using the wrong knife," he said quietly. I looked up surprised. He hadn't offered an unsolicited observation in all the months he'd been here. He came forward, took the chef's knife from the block, a wedding gift we rarely used, and selected a smaller, narrower boning knife instead. "For the shallots," he said. "Finer control." He then proceeded to show me, his large aged hands moving with a surgeon's precision, transforming the shallot into a pile of perfect minute dice. "Eleanor always said I was the better cook," he murmured, almost to himself. From that day on, the kitchen became neutral, shared territory. He would often appear while I was cooking, offering a quiet tip, sharing a memory of a dish Eleanor used to make. It was never an intrusion, it was a contribution. He was teaching me, and in doing so, he was weaving the threads of his past into the fabric of our present. The change in Mark was just as profound. He started asking his father for advice, not on life, which still felt too vast a chasm to cross, but on small, tangible things. A stubborn leak under the sink, a wobble in the deck railing. He was acknowledging the engineer, the builder, the man of practical solutions. And Robert, in turn, began to emerge from his shell. He would inspect the problem, his eyes sharp and analytical, and offer a diagnosis. They began a project together, building a new birdhouse for the backyard. It was a small, simple thing, but watching them in the garage, measuring and sanding, their heads bent together in concentration, was like watching a bridge being built, plank by careful plank. The space we made for him was not an empty room we reluctantly cleared. It was an active, intentional creation. It was the patience to listen to a story told slowly. It was the humility to learn from his quiet expertise. It was the respect for his grief, without letting it define every interaction. We stopped trying to fit him into the rigid box of our old life and instead allowed our life to expand, to become more generous, more inclusive of his history and his needs. He was no longer the old man whose presence required a justification. He was Robert, Grandpa, a man who had loved deeply, built great things, and was now tentatively teaching us how to build a new kind of family. The question that had once torn us apart, "Why is he here?" had finally found its answer. He was here because this was his home, and we had finally learned that a home isn't defined by the square footage it occupies, but by the space we willingly, lovingly make for one another.